This is an IWP media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent accredited graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. For more information, visit iwp.edu.
Hi, welcome to the IWP Podcast. I'm Jim Robbins, the Dean of Academics here at the Institute for World Politics in Washington, D.C. Our guest today is Christine Balling, Senior Vice President for Professional Affiliations here at IWP and a faculty member at IWP. Christine, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Why don't you tell everybody what you do here at IWP?
Well, yes, I do teach a course here. It's the title is a bit unwieldy. It's female roles in contemporary insurgencies and small armies, and we can go into why I teach that course at some point. I'm also the Senior Vice President for Professional Affiliations, where I work with other institutions with whom we either want to have events or have joint academic programs, that sort of thing. Also, I have a hand in our marketing strategy, our PR strategy, and I happen to be an alum. I earned my master's here back in 2016.
Right. So why don't you tell people why you teach that course? It's a pretty good story.
All right. Well, before I came to IWP, I lived and worked in the country of Colombia. And I started my work by founding a Colombian nonprofit where my mission was to work with young kids who were at risk for recruitment by the Marxist guerrilla groups down there, specifically the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, and then to a lesser extent, the National Liberation Army, the ELN. So I more or less started by doing one project in a remote mountain village in the department of Tolima, where a bunch of kids had to help me decide where a new playground should be placed. The idea was that instead of just gifting a playground to this village, the local kids would have to use the democratic process to determine where the playground should be built and why. So it was a very neat situation where I first got the permission of the village mayor for him to give me candidate sites, and then a group of kids and I went around the candidate sites, and then we had a debate and vote in public in front of other members of the community, where representatives for each site would debate as to where the playground should go and why. The kids would vote, and then no matter what the result, the mayor and all the town's officials had to respect that vote, and that's where the playground went. Now, just to give context, we're talking about a village that is about a 4-hour drive up a mountain dirt road, very, very remote. And so another thing I learned doing this first project was I was the first American that these people had ever met. So I became very quickly a de facto representative of the United States in what was essentially territory that was, if not occupied at that point, still very much influenced by these Marxist guerrilla group. And the United States is essentially enemy number one for them, even before the Colombian government. And in any event, so one project, I filmed the first project. I showed a video to some folks at our embassy in Bogota, did the paperwork to start the actual foundation. And then over the years, went project by project. I ended up getting funding from United States Special Operations Command, USAID subcontractors, Spirit of America, all essentially U.S. funding. And eventually, I was introduced to then SOCOM Commander Admiral McRaven, who directed that I start advising the Special Operations Command South Commander, the late General Mulholland, and our civil affairs and IO teams downrange. To get to the course title, my main deliverable was to create the Colombian Army's first tactical guide on demobilization. And for that work, I interviewed numerous demobilized FARC fighters, most of whom ended up by chance being female. And so through these interviews, and all of these folks were recently escaped. So we're talking they had only escaped within 2 or 3 weeks prior to my meeting them. Many of them had either been kidnapped or voluntarily joined when they were in their teens. And so I became very interested in why girls joined versus boys, what their respective experiences were like when they were among the ranks, and then why they would demobilize from a group. What was the motivation? And so the real life example was when I was putting together this guide, I saw that the Colombian Army had already identified that the most valuable demob guerrilla was a female versus a male. And they put a price on that. So the largest reward for someone to encourage a fighter to demobilize was, again, if a woman versus a man.
Why was that?
Well, mainly because women were fighters, so there were female combatants, but generally speaking, women held a variety of roles in a given front. In order to survive among the ranks, also, females, and it's not that pleasant to say it, but I have to, would essentially have to shack up with the most powerful male fighter they could in order to get the best food, get the best uniform, that sort of thing. So they quickly would also know who was who in the zoo for their own purposes of survival. But again, generally speaking, women were often the comms people. They were the radio operators between fronts. They were the propagandists. They were often the recruiters. So they would be the ones who would go into a village and recruit not only girls but boys. They would have the relationship with the sympathetic or forcibly cooperating community members. So when a female demobbed, she would know of incredible amounts of information in terms of what the past, present, and future operations of a given front would be.
So you were really doing hands-on public diplomacy and counterinsurgency through this process that started with building playgrounds.
Yeah, no, exactly. And frankly, I had no idea. That was not my mission. My mission initially was, I'm going to build this playground for these kids and they're going to use the democratic process. But it caught on. And I ended up using my high school motto, non sibi. I went to Phillips Academy Andover, which means not for oneself in Latin, because I wanted to form a team of these kids. So it was the El Equipo Non Sibi del Tolima, the non-sibi team of Tolima, the department in which I started work. And that worked perfectly because it was very easy to understand. It was easy to translate to Spanish. And it had nothing to do with me as an individual, which was important. I didn't want this, that it's like, oh, an American is gifting this sort of thing. So it became a very easily translatable message of unity and empowerment. I hate that term. I'm going to use it anyway. So one little project grew into many different playgrounds. We did marches for peace, which at the time was very significant because I was operating before the Colombians struck the peace deal with the FARC in 2016. We had leadership summits where the kids from all different villages around would actually pretend to, for example, advise the Colombian government and how to negotiate with the FARC. We did medical brigades, which admittedly was a tit for tat on my end because the FARC would often have medical brigades to win over the population. So that was a little bit on the nose, but yeah. I mean, and that's why the Colombian military, with whom I ended up co-branding on my more ambitious project, was so interested in working with me because they had a difficult time countering the narrative from the Marxist guerrillas that they were the enemy. And so I was able, through the team of non-Civi kids, was able to build a bridge between the Colombian military, which includes military police, and the populace. So it was successful again in that way because it was by, with, and through these kids. Again, it wasn't me. It wasn't Christine the Gringa. It was the non-Civi team bringing the military together with the members of the community.
And later you did some work in Iraq.
Yes, that's right. Well, so what happened was after doing so much field work in Colombia, a mentor of mine, General Barry McCaffrey, suggested that I get a graduate degree to complement my field work. And I discovered the Institute of World Politics. And the reason I decided to get my degree here was when I saw the scholar practitioner model, that was it for me. I mean, as a mid-career professional, I had no interest in just going into a classroom where it would just be theory. Nothing wrong with that. But for me, it wasn't a good match.
Right.
And
you just have to unlearn a lot.
Yeah, no, exactly. Theory, especially when it came to some current attitudes about romanticizing Marxism in Latin America. I had no time for that. So when I was a student here, I focused on females in various insurgency groups. That was sort of my main deliverable as an independent study I did. And towards the end of my time here, I had just read about an all-female Peshmerga unit. The Peshmerga are the army for the Kurds in Iraq. And they had just formed an all-female Yazidi unit, the Yazidis being the victims of the ISIS genocide in 2014. I read this article, and I was having lunch with my professor, who was a former chief of station for the CIA over there. And I said, it would be so cool if I could go over to Iraq and interview those women just like I did in Colombia with the FARC. And he looks at me across the table and he said, well, why wouldn't you? So there you go. That's an IWP professor. And so he took a real chance on me, frankly. It turns out his former deputy of chief of station was our man in Kurdistan. So he put me in touch with him. That gentleman then put me in touch with the Kurdish regional government. And after about 2 months of back and forth diplomacy, the quid pro quo I was able to offer the Kurdish regional government was I was going to write an article for Foreign Affairs about this Yazidi company, because I had written several articles for Foreign Affairs before. But not for an IWP professor. There is no way that I ever would have landed in Iraqi Kurdistan, which is exactly what I did 3 weeks after graduating. So some people go take a vacation in Hawaii. I landed in Erbil.
That's great. A great IWP story. I mean, it's a great story per se, but just, the scholar practitioner model.
Yep.
And now you're the practitioner.
Yeah, that's right.
You're teaching what you did.
That's right.
Passing it on.
Yep. And it's been great because again, I think I'm not the smartest woman in the room necessarily, but because I've walked the walk, my perspective, especially when I'm talking to female students and some of whom are veterans themselves, that it's just a different perspective, because I can say, look, I've sat in front of these women fighters. I've seen them tell their stories. I've seen them cry. I mean, I've got the ground truth. So it's just a very unique perspective in the classroom.
So when we're looking at Latin American issues today, it seems like that part of the world doesn't get the right amount of attention that it should be getting, particularly from the United States.
That's right. There were some bad jokes about, just say, not to name the former commander of Southcom, jokes or lamented the fact that he had to beg for one helicopter when he went in front of Congress. So yes, unfortunately, from a military perspective, funding-wise, Southcom, generally speaking, especially given what was going on in the Middle East, doesn't get the same amount of funding. State Department, again, it's just been seen as a low priority region, even though it's our region. I mean, we're part of the Western Hemisphere, and certainly as all the issues around immigration attest, our Hispanic population continues to grow, which is a great thing. And the real problem is that, as you say, because this has been sort of a back burner region, our adversaries, number one, China and Russia, have had the run of the place. China specifically, in terms of their investment or infrastructure investments they've made in Latin America, not necessarily even those countries who are our enemies, who are pro-communist, or even our friends have accepted the largesse that comes, of course, with such a high price from the Chinese. And then the Russians are very... They've been very active in supporting our adversaries in the region, specifically Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. So Iran also, another group that's been very big supporter of Venezuela. So it's a real shame that we've been asleep at the wheel. But I do very much hope that now that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in office, I think things are about to change. And as we've all seen, even President Trump himself has made statements about the U.S. Having, we'll put it this way, more say in how the Panama Canal is run, designating drug cartels as terrorist organizations, which has very specific implications. The fact that despite Biden's silly gesture of taking Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism, it's now back on, and justifiably so. And I would argue that now that the drug cartels are terrorist groups, I think Venezuela should be, and possibly might be, the next official state sponsor of terrorism in the region.
Yeah, they took the Houthis off the list, too. That was...
Oh, I didn't see that.
Oh, that was before, but that was sort of like a carrot stick thing. Like, hey, we won't call you terrorists if you'll just stop shooting at us.
Yeah.
It didn't work, obviously.
Yeah, no, I don't... Carrots don't work with terrorist groups. I guess they're not vegetarians.
Well, let's talk about Venezuela for a second. I mean, with the Maduro regime and what's going on with all the political instability regarding that, and you have a country that has some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. I mean, we're busy trying to pacify the Middle East in order to get access to energy. And right here, Venezuela, where we used to have an amazing presence, and it used to be pumping as much oil as it could, and now their whole thing has collapsed. And now we have this, Maduro corruptly manipulating the system, to enhance his own power, and, threatening to liberate Puerto Rico if, President Trump tries anything down there. So, I mean, what's your take on Venezuela?
Well, So the bottom line is Venezuela is the biggest problem for the United States and its allies in the region, hands down. Until there is a democratic leadership back, whether it's Edmundo Gonzalez, who actually won the election. The opposition party he represents is led by Maria Corina Machado, who I actually interviewed several years ago. Until a legitimate government, a democratic, freedom-loving government is in place, the region as a whole will continue to be, I think, increasingly unstable. Without a peaceful democratic Venezuela, the cartels will be able to continue to operate pretty much freely in terms of what they do in cooperation with the Maduro government, with the cocaine production in Colombia. So too, I have to say, unfortunately, for FARC 2.0 and the ELN, those organizations are involved in the drug trade. They are given refuge in Venezuela. So that's one thing. The bad news is I don't think Maduro will go peacefully. I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, what can the United States do to kind of push the process along diplomatically? Like, would he be open to some kind of a deal where, we go in and help save their oil infrastructure, or is he so ideologically driven that even self-interest won't help?
I would say self-interest. I mean, a leader, a tyrant like that has no regard for his people, which is why millions of them have fled and ended up here in the United States. I mean, he doesn't care. If he cared, he wouldn't be running his country the way he does. So no, I don't think there's any hope for that. What might be possible is the generals are all very loyal to him. His right-hand man is also very loyal. There's a possibility that those beneath might be more motivated to leave the country in other democratic hands if they had some sort of asylum, some sort of immunity. There is a $25 million price on Maduro's head right now.
Is that right?
Yes. It was just increased from $15 million to $25 million for the U.S. From us. We have the wanted poster.
What's he wanted for?
This is drugs. This is actually for drug trafficking. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know the details. But again, now that cartels are considered terrorist groups, well, he's aiding and abetting terrorists now, which I think, again, might actually become a formal designation.
Right. So that opens up all kinds of tools that we can use.
Yes.
As a designated terrorist group, seizing finances, renditioning people, doing all kinds of things with that designation.
That's right. And I think also a very important thing that we can do, and we are doing already, is supporting the Venezuelan opposition. Gonzalez and Machado, I mean, they're constantly online. There are many members of Congress who have publicly supported them. Secretary of State Rubio has, President Trump has. When Maduro kidnapped Maria Corina Machado for a few hours, Trump, prior to his inauguration, actually came out on Truth Social and said something to the effect like, "Don't touch a hair on her head."
Mm-hmm. Now, who is she?
I'm sorry. Maria Corina Machado is the actual leader of the Venezuelan opposition.
Right.
She was, by law, she was unable to run as the presidential candidate, which is why Gonzalez is running in her stead. But it's basically her.
Right. She's the leader of the movement.
Yeah. And she's been fighting for a free Venezuela for at least 15 years. I mean, she's a woman to be reckoned with. She's quite something.
So there's a strong pro-democracy sentiment in Venezuela.
Yes.
It simply needs to be harnessed in some positive way, given support, given whatever we can do for them, whether it's public promotion of their cause, exposure of what their regime is doing, or more direct things that the United States might be able to do.
Yep, absolutely. And the reason I am hopeful is that one thing that we've seen is that, for example, when the Venezuelan opposition organizes a march in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado specifically, Venezuelans around the world organize marches themselves. I mean, the Venezuelan people who are the diaspora, who are had to leave, they all want their homeland returned to freedom and democracy. I mean, it's actually very moving. So that's why I'm very hopeful, is that the Venezuelan people, no matter where they are very vocal in supporting the opposition movement that's in Venezuela today. And as I said, especially in the U.S., we've been giving voice to their fight, and I think we, as you say, need to continue to do that.
Oh, sure. I mean, Venezuela used to be great. They had a
Yes.
booming economy. They had freedom.
Yep.
Anything that you would want. Tourism, all kinds of great stuff. Right. The oil economy was incredible until they blew it. I mean, add socialism and see what happens. It's the usual story.
That's right.
So with the Trump administration coming in, as you've already said, we're going to see more attention being paid to Latin America. I mean, what's the issue with the Panama Canal? Because I see critics of the president saying it's like, oh, he's just, lost in a time warp, like he's Teddy Roosevelt, or, like it's the 1970s or something like that. But we have genuine security concerns and other concerns regarding Panama right now.
Yes, I mean the thing is that it's a bit of a gray area. But when President Carter signed the deal proclamation to give the Panama Canal back to Panama, there was an understanding that it would be run in a way that was still favorable to the United States. In other words, that United States enemies and those of Panama, because the assumption was that they were continue to be allies, would be in charge, would be calling the shots. The issue now is, and I must say it to an extent, it's our fault because our Western Hemisphere foreign policy has been so weak. The issue now is that there are Chinese companies or technically Hong Kong companies that control a certain number of the ports. So, I think at the very least, Trump, with his announcement that we need to take back the Panama Canal, whether it literally means seize control by force, I certainly hope that's actually not the case. What I think it means is he's saying to the president of Panama, let's sit down and negotiate. And I think that the president will do that eventually. Obviously, there's the tit-for-tat posturing. Obviously, the president of Panama needs to show his people that he's not just going to roll over. But Panama fundamentally, at least this presidential administration, is pro-U.S. So I think the idea is to for Secretary of State Marco Rubio to sit down and negotiate a deal that is much more favorable for the United States, shipping interests economically and then also security-wise whether it's that U.S. companies take over more ports, I wouldn't know what the details were. But the last thing I'll add, I think equally important, and I think this could be a bargaining chip, is the United States should help Panama secure its southern border. Because the border between Panama and in Colombia is this godforsaken place called the Darien Gap, through which all the migrants who either come from or pass through South America have to go through in order to get to Central America and us. The current Panamanian administration has done some fence building or whatever, But I mean, talk about a win-win for the United States is if we were able to send Army Corps of Engineers or whomever to help Panama secure its southern border. By definition, that would lessen the load on ours. And so I think that a negotiation to that, adding that to the negotiation around the canal would be a very smart move.
Oh, very smart. It not only helps them, it helps us.
Exactly.
It's part of the sweetener for the deal on the canal. It totally makes sense.
Yeah. Yep. And not only immigration. Again, now it's drugs come through that Darien Gap. So again, closing that down is a counter-terrorist operation as well.
Oh, fantastic. When you say like the tough language with Panama, and it's kind of backed up by history since, and in Bush 1, we did invade Panama.
Right.
So there's always that possibility. I don't think the conditions are the same now, clearly not the same.
Right.
But, they have a historical memory.
Yep.
I mean, even if Americans have forgotten about it, they know about it. So when they hear the tough language, they can kind of, it's in the background at least. But that's part of the opening posture.
Yes.
Right? Like, we'll get tough, but then we'll make a deal. What do you think about things like the Gulf of America?
Well, you know what? Bottom line is that's signaling also. Now it's a tit for tat. I mean, not that it was done in jest, because it wasn't done in jest, or President Trump didn't say it in jest. I think it's actually happening now. But it's an important signal, which is to say, and let me be very optimistic about it. Number one, it is a direct, to Mexico, obviously, and the current administration of Mexico is not a pro-American administration, technically speaking, no matter what President Sheinbaum says. I guess a very positive spin would just say that the Gulf belongs to all America, the Americas. But no, bottom line is, I think it's a great sign that, again, U.S. foreign policy in the Americas is now a thing in a way that it wasn't before. So it's good, I guess.
I think Gulf of the Americas actually sounds better.
Yeah, no, it does.
Yeah, this is kind of a ring to it.
Yeah, but you know what? I think it's Gulf of America.
Oh, yeah, that's what the president said.
Right.
Gulf
of the Americas would be perhaps a bit more of a diplomatic thing, but in any event.
Oh, yeah, like we all share the Gulf. I mean, how many countries border on it? But no, Gulf of America, right? It's America. It's a map maker's bonanza.
No, exactly. That's right.
I can't wait to see the first map with that on it.
Right.
That's going to be incredible. Well, since we mentioned migration, and I know that not all of the illegal migration is Latin American per se. I mean, they get people coming in from all over the world. How they get to Mexico is an interesting question just by itself. When you see people coming over from Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, how are they getting? Okay, an interesting question. But the president has highlighted, and in his inaugural address, made it like his number one issue is closing that border. So what are the different tools available other than, sending troops and building fences? I mean, what else can the U.S. do? And you mentioned like closing off the Darien Gap. What else can we do to try to like stop all this?
Well, unfortunately, I think, specifically with the millions of Venezuelans, I think we are probably looking at even more fleeing Venezuela. So there's nothing to be done about that until the Maduro regime is out of business. I think that what we could do is help countries, quote unquote, along the path, for example, Colombia, support the refugees. In other words, see if there's and maybe some Central American countries to help them either deport or support the refugees so that they don't make it eventually to the United States. But that's also very tough. With regard to Colombia, I mean, certainly I think they could use our help managing the flow of refugees from Venezuela, but the Colombian administration is anti-American. Well, the former president himself is a former M19 guerrilla, and so he's not politically interested.
The current president.
Yes.
Of Colombia.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The current president of Colombia.
Excuse me. Current president of Colombia is a former M19 guerrilla. Sorry about that. So ideologically, he's already certainly not a fan of Trump and whatever. So that's a little more difficult. The Colombian presidential elections are only a year away. So I think, generally speaking, we can very much hope that somebody else comes into office who's more moderate and pro-U.S. Because actually, with a renewed, strong relationship with Colombia, that could do a lot of good. Right now, what we're welcome to do with the Colombian government is pretty limited.
Yeah, there's a lot of violence going on in Colombia right now.
Yes. As I mentioned, back in 2016, there was a peace deal struck with the FARC, but to be sort of overly... the short version is the vast majority of the surviving leaders went back into the jungle. There's what they call FARC dissidents now, which is FARC 2.0. They've regrouped. And what's happening on the border is the ELN, I mentioned, the National Liberation Army,
right,
and the FARC are actually fighting each other in this area called Catatumbo. And it's brutal. I mean, it's a massacre. And I'm very sad to say that the Colombian government, President Petro has yet to get a handle on it. So it's terrifying to the point, believe it or not, where Colombians who live, this is a border area, are fleeing to Venezuela. That's how bad it is.
Right.
So it's a real shame. Yes, generally speaking, the security situation is deteriorating in Colombia, and my personal opinion is that's largely due to the current Colombian administration's politics and, let's say, the way that they've been dealing with the Colombian armed forces is not quite the same way that the previous administration was. They're not. I think he has sort of an ambivalent attitude towards the Colombian armed forces.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note that the FARC and ELN aren't really buddies. It's, just because they were guerrilla groups and they were fighting against the government back in the day, different leaders, different motivations, different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, just, there were different divisions to them that, now they're coming out, especially if the, ELN controls the presidency. Of course, you're going to see splits and divisions like that.
Yeah, yes. I mean, but see, this is a new thing. See, back in the day, the ELN, I mean, I won't go into detail, but, they were very much, Rauca. The FARC and the ELN were sort of cohabiting a little bit. And especially during the last decade before, with all the focus on striking a peace deal with the FARC, the ELN were sort of in the background doing their thing. But yes, to your point, they're not buddies. Now, what's happening in Catatumbo is essentially demonstrating that those days are over. And as limited as this skirmish is now, it is very destabilizing and very demoralizing for the Colombian people, because it's sort of, at least on social media, one is getting the sense that the Colombian people are saying to, geez Luis, are we going to get back to the point where Colombia was before President Uribe took office in the 90s? Like, it's a real, it's very nerve-wracking for the Colombian people right now, I think.
In the Trump first term, there was a successful program run out of the State Department to try to convince people to stay in their own countries. Like if you want a better future, then build one in your own country. And that messaging actually was fairly effective. This was the program that was then handed to Vice President Harris in her role as border czar, which she kind of dropped. But it was successful in the first Trump term. Are we going to see more messaging like that? Like stay home and do things in your Central American country or wherever. I know someplace like Venezuela or Colombia where there's open violence. I mean, people may be fleeing for legitimate reasons. But in other countries where it's more peaceful and people are just leaving because they don't see a future, can we convince them that, yes, there is a future if you just stay in your own country, develop it, and maybe the U.S. can help?
Yes, I think that that's perhaps where USAID comes in. Like, I do think, I know that there is a pause now on foreign aid, as it should be, because I think there were some programs that were sort of a bit goofy and more based on domestic politics rather than something that would actually help, but as you say, a peaceful Central American country. But yes, I think that USAID's type projects in these countries to whether it's microfinancing or even a pro-democracy, but they do have value. It would be a bit rich for us, as you point out, to suggest to the Venezuelans that they should just stay in Venezuela or the Cubans, or the Nicaraguan, So yes, for certain nations, I think soft power and investment, again, like a USAID, absolutely valuable, and I think it's important for the people of those nations to understand that Americans want them to succeed at home. So I think that type of public diplomacy is crucial.
What do you see as other issues with respect to our relationship with Latin America or the Caribbean? I mean, we've seen the influence of China, Russia. Cuba is still active, promoting its stuff in the region along with Venezuela, Iran. I mean, are things going to get better? What do you think?
Yes, again, I'm very hopeful. As long as we have our focus renewed, or I should say started, we can do a tremendous amount of good. And here's the bottom line. We have a tremendous advantage over Russia, China, and Iran when it comes to cultural influence, because we have democracy in common. Even with Venezuela, it's a failed democracy now. But as I mentioned before, the Venezuelan people, the Cuban people, value freedom and democracy. So as old-fashioned as promoting democracy has become, and as tragically how Che Guevara and Castro have been romanticized here at home. By the way, this is a real problem because that's influenced some of our congressional members. I think it's time to go back to say, you know what? Promoting democracy abroad is not imposing something that is unwanted when it comes to Latin America. It's building it back up, because the vast majority of people in Latin America would thrive and welcome democracy. China can't do that. If we really get our act together, China, they're not really, I don't even think they're really interested in that. They're doing business.
Oh, right.
So whether it's culture, whether it's political culture or culture writ large, language, shared past, we have so much we can build on in terms of public diplomacy. And so, yes, let's dust off the whole thing that, promoting democracy is actually something that is worth doing and would be welcomed. It's not some sort of imperialist invasion.
Right. Oh, yeah. Democracy promotion as opposed to nation building.
Exactly.
I mean, kind of
difference.
The nation building projects that failed kind of gave a bad taste to any kind of ideological promotion.
Right. And again, sort of harping on it, but I mean, once Venezuela is restored to democracy, Cuba's influence, I think, will be pretty much over. I mean, as poor of a country as Cuba is, its intelligence apparatus is like disproportionately effective. Cuban intelligence has had for years a profound influence in terms of how the Hugo Chavez administration and now the current administration, Maduro, has been run. I mean, the Cubans are behind the scenes in many ways. So that's another, as I said, once Cuba loses Venezuela, I think that will create an ideological shift in the region. Again, Marxism versus democracy, that will be a death blow. So, yeah.
Oh, sure. I mean, going back a ways, of course, the Cubans were active in Africa. They were in Vietnam. I mean, some of the torturers, when you talk about in the prisons, of our POWs, were Cuban. Cubans active in Mexico, a big destabilizing force that was utilized by the Soviet Union, and now just sort of on their own. They just do their own things. And of course, they're highly tied to China now. What's the chance of Cuba? We think that, when, eventually Castro would go, he never went. He just wrote it out. And I mean, everybody hoping, like with the embargo and, pressure against Cuba, it just seems to persist, that damn regime. I mean, when is Cuba finally going to throw out the communists?
Well, as I said, I actually think it's very much tied with what happens in Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela, they get their oil from there. I mean, Venezuela is, that's how they're moving their chess pieces. Or I should say, I'm sorry, Venezuela is their chess piece. Venezuela is the queen that they zip around the chessboard over there. That, I think that will be the end. The Cuban government is very, very wealthy. I mean, they're incredibly rich. So there's really no motivation for change there. And unfortunately, I don't even think that our sanctions have any effect at all, by the way. I'm somewhat neutral on that. I don't think that keeping it on the list as a state sponsor of terrorism was a good, important move. But in terms of our sanctions, as long as the Cuban government is so wealthy and living off the fat of the land, there's not going to be a change.
Nothing Secretary Rubio can do to kind of turn up the heat on Havana?
Oh, I think, again, try with the economic sanctions directly, but the closer we can get Venezuela to being a true democracy, that's Cuba will go with it eventually.
Personally, I think it would be great to see a free and democratic Cuba. I've been waiting my whole life for that, just to see that domino fall. All the other communist states were falling. Cuba toughed it out. It's like a Cold War relic at this point.
Yeah. Well, but see, the thing is, just very quickly, back in 2012, believe it or not, the Aspen Institute had a trip to Cuba. I had been to participate in other programs. And so they sponsored a group of us, to go down to Havana. This was before the Obama, made it open for travel. So it was a special thing. And I was coming from Colombia, so I got very specific attention, let's just say, from the Cubans. And without going into that, but what was so striking to me is that my fellow Americans who were on this trip, I mean, some of them were from Northern California, and it was not a political thing, but there were some hardcore American communists who came along, and it was just like one big propaganda show, and it was sort of scary how the Americans were commiserating with our hosts in terms of how horrible imperialist the United States was and so forth. So that's another thing. I mean, there is ideological support for the Cuban government, especially in our university. So
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're all wearing the T-shirt.
that's right.
Uh,
That's right. Che Guevara.
And I always wondered about that Obama opening to Cuba and the delegations that went down there. I was just wondering what kind of like side deals were being discussed or kind of future sweetheart things. Imagine all that beachfront property down there.
Right.
Yeah, I can see some of these well-connected Americans kind of making their side deals.
Yes, that's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely. That they were going to, move down there after everything was hunky-dory and have their mansions and stuff. And it'd be like The Godfather. They're cutting up the cake, right? Making a deal, except this time with the communists instead of with Batista.
Yep.
So
No, it's horrible. The Canadian, a little known fact, and my fellow travelers during this trip saw it firsthand, is a lot of tourism that the Cuban government encourages is sex tourism down there. So, for example, one of my fellow travelers went out after hours with a couple other guys. They went into a bar, and they were rushed. It was really sad by 100. Well, they thought like at least 100 young women. Well, so that's like the Cuban government's dirty little secret, is that it's like Thailand. I know it's not a nice topic, but that's a lot of young Cuban females are surviving by state sanctioned prostitution.
Oh, I bet, and any American who engages in that kind of thing,
It's terrible.
they better understand that they're being followed and recorded and that,
Oh,
everything is, there's a whole Cuban counterintelligence operation set up on them, every single American who goes there. And so if they want to engage in that, they better just understand that it's going to be a part of their permanent record. And if it ever comes up again or they try to get government service, they may hear something from Havana about, oh, by the way.
Yes, no, there's no question. Not to mention, it's just sort of disgraceful.
Oh, yeah.
There's that.
There's that. Oh, yeah, the moral angle, sure. Yeah, but the national security angle,
Absolutely.
people just have to understand that. So, so you think the future we can look at optimistically with respect to Latin America, and that the Trump administration can probably do some good things?
I think so. I hope so. And I think even beyond the Trump administration, no matter whether it's Republican or Democrat that takes over, if we establish a solid, more robust foreign policy, military strategy, all of the above, USAID, build that foundation now, it will serve the hemisphere well for decades. I really, at the risk of sounding Pollyannish, a united Western Hemisphere a united democratic and free Western Hemisphere would be extremely powerful on the world stage.
Fantastic. Well, on that optimistic note, I think we can close it out. Christine Balling, thank you for joining us here on the IWP Podcast. It's been wonderful having you.
Great. It was fun.
And for IWP, I'm Jim Robbins. Join us next time for the IWP Podcast.
If you like our podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe. And if you are interested in learning more about the topics we covered here today and want to be a student at IWP, go to iwp.edu and click Apply now.